in the United States governing system, what is our governing authority? Now, we have political leaders who hold authority, but the highest authority in the land is the Constitution. And we know that those two things are not always in consonance with each other. Sometimes the political leaders will act in an unconstitutional manner. So when that is the case, what does it even mean to submit to your governing authorities? Is your authority first to the human being in office, or is it first to the document?
Well, I think it's first to the Constitution, and every political leader that you're talking about right there takes an oath, and the oath is to follow the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution if you're a state government official. So, if you disagree, and I think you need to hold them to that. There are DAs, district attorneys, in several states who have said, we're not going to enforce the law. Well, they need to go back and look at their oath. They may not like the law, but they're called to and vested with the responsibility and duty to enforce the laws. There's discretionary thing, but just to have a blanket statement and saying, I'm not going to do it, I don't see that as complying with their oath. So that's one place I would start, as they take an oath, and I think our allegiance is to the Constitution, not to individuals. Although individuals are vested with authority, and we should submit to them, as Peter said, with limits. But I think it's I think the Constitution is a wonderful document. It's amazing with its checks and balances, and the three branches of government, and the separation of powers. I mean, that was just so brilliant to think up something like that and put it in place. And we can talk about how that's abused, but if it's abused, then that's what the court system's for. So,
yeah, I think that, the way the Constitution was put together is so biblical, right? The concepts that are behind it all, understanding the sin nature of man, and how do we check that with systems, right? And so I agree with Herb 100%. We're a nation of laws, not of men. And I will say that when I was in the Department of Labor, every single person who came to serve raised their hand and did that pledge, whether you were Senate appointed or not. Even lowly little, admins running around. We all took that pledge to honor the Constitution. And I think what Herb is saying there at the end about the courts, right? That's the question, I think, is when, or I guess the next question is when, okay, so if there's a problem, what do you do about it, right? And then I think that's where the lawsuits come in, right? We have plenty of lawsuits flying around the courts saying this is unconstitutional. This is an elected man or woman, whether they be head of HHS or head of the Housing and Urban Development or, the White House or whatever, making a law, trying to create a law that is in violation of the Constitution. And so that's what we're living out what you're talking about.
Yeah, right.
With all this litigation. That's what that is. That's saying, no, the Constitution here, not people, just making law. Or following, if you're in the administrative state, not to get too wonky on you, but like Congress passes laws that say if you're going to do regulations in the government, in, the administration, in the White House, in all the agencies, the alphabet soup, you have to do it a certain way. That's not a constitutional law, but that's a statutory law, and they have to do that, right? So we have lawsuits saying, hey, you broke the rule, you did that, and you didn't do it the right way. And we have to, procedure matters, process matters. So you look at our whole docket, it's really a living out what you're talking about.
Yeah, totally.
Instead of just lawlessly saying, we're not going to do that.
Right.
Your average person probably doesn't wake up every day and think, well, this is an unjust law, so I'm going to file a lawsuit. So they're trying to make their decision of just, okay, should I go left or should I go right around this law? And I think to make those decisions, I think you need that foundational understanding of our allegiance first is to God, and then as citizens of the U.S. is to the United States Constitution, which quite honestly I think I don't really see any conflict between the U.S. Constitution and God. You know what I'm saying? That it was so well, that Herbert was saying, it was so brilliantly put together. It gave space for all that. But then once that comes on down, there is a process. If we think a law is unjust, there's a process for undoing it. It's not going rogue, as you were kind of describing a minute ago. It's following that process and somewhat trusting the process. And that's one of the problems that I see with the whole political sphere is people have lost confidence in the process, which, you know, quite honestly, just makes people want to withdraw. It makes us want to quit watching the news. It makes us want to not go to the school board meeting. It makes us not want to go to anything because we've lost confidence in the process. And I think what we're saying is if we don't engage with the process, we're not going to regain that trust. And so I think that's what we're saying here, if somebody has a comment on that.
And to the extent that these issues are addressed in the courts, you know, to remind people, no judge gets appointed without, you know, someone at least in the federal bench, someone in Congress voting and saying they can go there, and a president putting their name forward, actually. So that was the first step, right? The president puts the judge's name forward, and then in the Senate, they're deciding whether to send them to the court. But if you don't like the way these decisions are being made, then you got to back up and pay attention to who you're voting for Senate and for president, because they're the ones that are determining who's deciding your lawsuit. So, you know, and you know, judges, they're supposed to sort of be neutral, but they tend to be ideological, right? They tend to kind of follow ideology. So it matters the kind of people you're putting into office, and it makes the voting even that much more important.